In the quiet heart of the English countryside, a secret was sold beneath the glow of a single lantern. A young woman, trembling but unbroken, was auctioned like a debt and rescued by a widowed marquess whose eyes still carried the shadow of loss. But salvation comes at a price. Within the walls of his grand estate, whispers ignite, loyalties tremble, and hearts begin to burn with feelings neither of them can afford to confess. What happens when mercy becomes love, and love becomes forbidden? Subscribe now and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you more unforgettable tales of passion, courage, and second chances. Your presence helps this story live on. The Cotswolds, England, 1816. In a village where every curtain breathed with curiosity and every smile carried a verdict, the coaching inn stood like a polite stage for ugly things. Its stone walls were honey-colored, the same warm shade as the hills beyond, as if the world itself wished to pretend it was gentle. But inside the upstairs room, gentleness had been carefully rehearsed and then dismissed. The air smelled of damp wool, candle smoke, and old ale that could not quite be scrubbed away. Chairs had been arranged in neat rows as if for a charity lecture. A small platform waited at the front, draped in a linen cloth that looked clean from a distance and dishonest up close. Men murmured in low voices, careful with their manners, because cruelty in a small village did not come roaring like a beast. It arrived wearing a polished boot. Violet Ashford stood just behind the platform, her fingers curled around the edge of her reticule so tightly the fabric pinched. She had been told to keep her eyes lowered. She had been told to be grateful. She had been told, in the same calm tone someone might use to discuss the price of flour, that the debt could not be argued, and that she would be placed somewhere respectable if she did not make a scene. Respectable. That word had followed her for weeks like a shadow pretending to be a friend. She lifted her chin anyway. Her dress was a plain muslin gown, once cream, now dulled by too many careful washings. The empire waist sat high beneath her ribs, the sleeves long, the neckline modest. A narrow ribbon tied at her waist attempted cheerfulness and failed. Her gloves were clean but worn thin at the fingertips. A bonnet lay folded in her reticule like a reminder of the outdoors, of a world where skies still existed and people could still walk away. Violet's chestnut hair had been arranged into a low chignon by hands that were not kind, with a few curls left loose at her temples, not for beauty, but because her hairpins had been old and unforgiving. She could feel those pins now, biting into her scalp like warnings. A woman in the corner dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, the performance of sympathy so delicate it might have passed for virtue if Violet had been younger, if she had not learned what tears were worth in a room like this. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice trained for public niceness, cleared his throat and smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are gathered for a matter of unfortunate circumstance. Miss Violet Ashford has found herself in a position—" His eyes slid over her like a hand that requires swift resolution. "Let us proceed with generosity." Generosity. Violet tasted the lie in her mouth. A ripple of murmured approval moved through the chairs. Boots shifted. A cane tapped once, impatiently. A man in the front row leaned toward his companion and spoke softly, yet not softly enough. "Pretty enough," he said. "If she's desperate, she'll be obedient." Heat flashed behind Violet's eyes. Not tears. Fire. The auctioneer lifted a paper and began reciting details as if he were describing a parcel of land. Health, temperament, skills. "Literate," he said. "Adequate needlework. Suitable for domestic service." Domestic service! They had stripped her name of its meaning and stitched a cheaper label on top. The first offer came quickly. The second came faster. Each one made Violet's skin feel tighter, as if her body were shrinking to escape the gaze of the room. She told herself to breathe. She told herself to endure. She told herself that if she survived this moment without collapsing, she would still own something the world could not take. Then, halfway through another bid, the door opened. The sound was not loud, it did not slam, it did not announce itself. It simply changed the air. A hush swept through the room, precise and instinctive, as if every man had been trained to recognize a presence that required silence. Violet did not turn immediately. She felt it first in the way the auctioneer's smile faltered. She felt it in the way the men straightened, suddenly aware of their own posture. She felt it in the way even the candle flame seemed to hold still. When she turned, she saw him. He stood in the doorway as if the room belonged to him, not by arrogance, but by inevitability. Tall, broad-shouldered, a dark coat cut to perfection, as if even fabric obeyed him. The white of his cravat was crisp, his gloves immaculate. His hair, dark brown and neatly brushed back, caught the candlelight in restrained glints. His face was handsome in a way that did not ask for admiration. Strong jaw, stern mouth, eyes the color of cold steel. Those eyes moved across the room with a quiet assessment that felt like judgment. Hugh Weatherby, Marquess of Aldecombe. Violet had heard his name long before she ever saw him, spoken with reverence and caution in the same breath. A widower, a nobleman who had retreated from society, a man whose grief had become a kind of myth, as if sorrow itself had elevated him into something untouchable. He did not look at Violet first. He looked at the auctioneer. "What is this?" His voice was low, controlled, and it carried in a way that made the room shrink around it. The auctioneer swallowed. "My lord, we are merely—" "Stop!" The word was not shouted. It did not need to be. The auctioneer froze, paper trembling in his hands like a guilty confession. Hugh stepped forward. The boards creaked beneath his boots, and the sound seemed indecently ordinary in a room that had become unnatural. He came to the front without hurry, as if he had all the time in the world, as if haste were for men who did not have power. Only then did his gaze lift. It landed on Violet, not like the others had looked at her, not like hunger or amusement or entitlement. It landed like recognition. For a single heartbeat, Violet could not breathe. The room blurred around the edges, as if all of it, every chair, every whisper, every cruel mouth, had become irrelevant under the weight of that stare. His eyes did not strip her, they measured the damage. They acknowledged her dignity like an apology that did not require words. Violet hated herself for the sudden tremor that moved through her. She hated the way hope tried to rise, that dangerous, foolish thing. Hugh turned back to the auctioneer. "What is the debt?" The auctioneer stammered out a number, too eager to please, too relieved to be addressed by someone who mattered. Violet heard it and felt her stomach tighten. It was more than her father ever should have owed, more than any honest man could owe without help. Hugh reached into his coat, as if he had already decided. He pulled out a small leather billfold and removed banknotes with the ease of a man signing an ordinary letter. "I will settle it," he said. A murmur surged, shocked and hungry. The auctioneer blinked. "My lord, that is extremely generous." "It is necessary," Hugh replied, and his eyes sharpened. "And it is the end of this." One of the bidders found his courage, emboldened by drink or stupidity. "With respect, my lord, the sale has begun." Hugh's gaze slid toward him. The room went colder. "She is not livestock," Hugh said, each word placed carefully, like a blade being set on a table. "This is not a market for humiliation. If you have forgotten what decency looks like, I suggest you learn quickly." The man's face reddened. He opened his mouth, then thought better of it. Hugh handed the notes to the auctioneer. "Write a receipt," he said, "and if I hear of another charity event resembling this one, I will bring every name in this room into daylight." Daylight. In a village, daylight was punishment. The auctioneer's hands shook as he began scribbling. Chairs creaked, men shifting uncomfortably, suddenly aware that their respectable masks had cracked. Violet stood utterly still, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She expected Hugh to approach her as if to claim her, because that was what men did. She expected a hand on her arm, a possessive gesture that would tell the room she now belonged to someone with a title. Instead, He did something worse for her nerves and better for her soul. He offered nothing but distance. He stepped slightly aside, giving her space as if she were a person who deserved it. Then he spoke to her, not to the room, not to the auctioneer, not to the gossip waiting like wolves outside. To her. "Miss Ashford," he said. Her name, spoken with that calm gravity, sounded unfamiliar. It sounded like something worth protecting. Violet swallowed. "My lord." His eyes held hers. In that gaze was the quiet fact that he had seen what was happening to her and had chosen to stop it. But there was also something else, something restrained, guarded, as if he were afraid of what kindness might awaken. "You will leave," he said gently, and the gentleness in that command made Violet's throat tighten more than cruelty ever had. "Now." She should have asked where. She should have asked why. She should have asked what he wanted in return, because the world had trained her to believe rescue was never free. But her pride, bruised and stubborn, rose like a shield. "I can walk," she said, because she could not bear the idea of being carried out like a prize. A brief flicker crossed his face. Approval, perhaps, or respect. "Then we will walk," he answered. They moved toward the door, and the room watched them as if they were witnessing a scandal being born. Violet felt every stare as a weight on her back. She forced herself not to hurry. She forced herself not to look down. At the threshold, Hugh paused and looked back once. His voice remained calm, but it landed like iron. "This ends here," he said. "If any man follows, you will regret it." No one moved. Violet stepped into the corridor, and the air there felt cooler, cleaner, almost unreal. Her legs trembled now that she was out of view, but she kept walking because stopping would mean collapsing. Downstairs, the innkeeper's wife pretended not to stare. The innkeeper pretended not to listen. The world pretended nothing had happened, because in villages, pretending was a kind of currency. Outside, the afternoon was pale and cold, the sky stretched thin with winter light. A carriage waited, dark, polished, noble. The footman stood straight as a post, eyes politely fixed ahead. Everything about it screamed power. Violet stopped beside the carriage door, suddenly aware that escaping the auction did not mean escaping the story it would become. She could already hear the whispers. The marquis, the girl, the debt, the bargain no one had heard but everyone would invent. Hugh did not rush her. He stood beside the carriage, the wind tugging faintly at his coat, his presence steady as if he had anchored himself for a storm. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, meant only for her. "You were being sold," he said, not as accusation but as fact. "That will not happen again." Something in Violet's chest clenched so sharply it almost hurt. The words were simple. The promise was enormous. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Why?" she asked, because she could not afford to be naive. Men do not walk into rooms like that for nothing. For a moment, Hugh's expression tightened, as if the question struck a bruise beneath the skin. Then he answered with a restraint that felt like honesty. "Because I was there," he said, "and because it was wrong." Violet's breath caught. Not because the answer was romantic, but because it was rare. He opened the carriage door, then stepped back again, giving her the dignity of choice, even when she had none. Violet gathered her skirts and climbed inside. The seat smelled faintly of leather and clean linen. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, because if she let them shake, she might never stop. Hugh entered opposite her, leaving space between them that felt both safe and unbearable. The door shut. The carriage began to move, wheels crunching softly over gravel. For several moments the only sound was the rhythm of travel and Violet's own heartbeat. Then Hugh spoke, looking out the window as if it cost him to say the words aloud. "You will stay at Aldecombe," he said. "Only until I can arrange something suitable. There will be a respectable reason for your presence. You will not be left to the village's imagination." Violet turned her head slightly, watching the profile of a man who looked carved from discipline. "And what reason would satisfy them?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "You will serve as governess to my children." Children. The word landed oddly in Violet's mind, soft and sharp at once. Hugh continued, still controlled, still careful. "It is temporary. It will be proper. It will keep you safe." Safe. Violet stared at her hands, at the pale skin and the faint redness where her nails had pressed too hard. She wanted to believe in safety. She wanted to believe in this quiet man's promise, but the world had taught her that safety often came with a price. She lifted her gaze again, and this time Hugh looked back. The carriage rocked gently, and for a heartbeat their eyes held in the small moving space between them. Violet felt the tension of it, not desire as the crude men upstairs would have named it, but something deeper and more dangerous, the awareness of being truly seen. Hugh's voice softened just slightly, as if he was speaking to the part of her that had been forced onto that platform. "I will not allow anyone to harm you," he said. "Not while you're under my roof." Violet's throat tightened. She kept her voice steady by sheer will. "Under your roof," she repeated. "That sounds like a kind of ownership." A flicker crossed his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or frustration with himself. "No," he said quietly. "It is a kind of responsibility." Responsibility? Violet looked away, because if she did not, she might do something foolish, like believe him completely. She watched the countryside unfold beyond the window. Hedgerows, bare trees, fields rolling toward distant hills. The world looked peaceful, almost beautiful, like a lie painted carefully over hardship. The carriage carried her farther from the inn, farther from the room where her humanity had been priced, and closer to a manor where grief lived behind honey-colored stone. Violet's fingers curled around her reticule again, not from fear of the Marquis beside her, but from the terrifying realization that rescue was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. The carriage slowed as it turned from the main road onto a winding path bordered by hedgerows, glistening with morning dew. Mist clung to the earth like a memory that refused to lift, wrapping the landscape in a silence that felt older than words. The honey-colored stones of Aldecombe Manor appeared gradually through the fog, rising from the hills as though time itself had built them to endure grief. Violet pressed her gloved fingers against the carriage window, her heart tightening with awe and fear. The estate was vast, an elegant fortress softened by ivy and light, but something about its stillness made her chest ache. It was too quiet, too watchful, the kind of silence that belonged to a house that had forgotten laughter. Hugh Weatherby sat opposite her, his gaze fixed outside, though Violet suspected he saw none of it. He had the look of a man carrying invisible weight, his expression carved into control so complete it was nearly inhuman. He had not spoken much since they left the village, and Violet, torn between gratitude and unease, dared not interrupt the wall of composure he wore like armor. When the carriage stopped, the footman opened the door, and the sharp air of the Cotswolds swept in. Violet gathered her shawl around her shoulders and stepped down carefully. The gravel crunched beneath her slippers. She tilted her face upward to take in the house fully, the tall windows, the graceful chimneys, the wisteria vines now bare for winter. Beauty lived here, but it was a beauty drained of warmth, a painting left too long in the shade. The great oak doors opened before she could speak. A woman in her middle 50s stood waiting, hands folded, expression stern but not cruel. Her grey hair was pulled into a neat bun under a white cap, her dress dark and practical. She was the kind of woman who kept order with a look. "Mrs. Brimley," Hugh said, his voice firm yet low. "This is Miss Ashford. She will serve as governess for the children until further notice." Mrs. Brimley's eyes swept over Violet from head to hem, weighing every thread, every breath. "Yes, my lord." She turned to Violet and curtsied, the gesture polite but cool. "Welcome to Aldecombe, Miss Ashford. We rise early here. Breakfast is taken promptly at 8, and the children's lessons begin thereafter." "Thank you," Violet said softly. Her voice barely carried, as though she feared disturbing the air around her. Hugh's attention lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, then he nodded to Mrs. Brimley. "Ensure she is settled. I will speak with the children before dinner." He turned, his boots echoing on the stone as he disappeared down a long corridor. Violet watched his figure fade into the dimness, her breath catching unexpectedly. There was something about the way he moved, measured, deliberate, restrained, as if every step reminded him of all the things he could no longer feel. Mrs. Brimley cleared her throat, snapping Violet back to herself. "This way, Miss Ashford." They climbed the grand staircase, the banister polished smooth by generations of hands. Portraits lined the walls, ancestors no doubt painted with the solemn pride of lineage. Their painted eyes followed her as she ascended. At the landing, the corridor split in two directions, one side leading deeper into shadow. The house smelled faintly of beeswax, lavender, and something older, perhaps loneliness. Mrs. Brimley led her to a modest chamber overlooking the gardens. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a basin by the window. A single sprig of dried lavender hung on the wall, the scent faint but comforting. "You may rest here for now," Mrs. Brimley said. "The nursery is at the east end of the house. You'll find the children there after luncheon." "Are they aware of my arrival?" Violet asked. The housekeeper hesitated. "They are aware, miss. Acceptance, however, is another matter." Violet understood. She lowered her gaze. "I will do my best." Mrs. Brimley's tone softened, if only slightly. "Do not let them see fear. Children sense weakness like weather." When she was gone, Violet sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled slowly. Her reflection in the small mirror by the desk looked pale and uncertain. The morning's frost still clung to her bonnet, and her curls had loosened. She untied the ribbons, letting her hair fall softly around her face, then folded her hands in her lap and whispered, "You are safe. For now, you are safe." Outside her window, the manor garden stretched wide, framed by a distant view of the village below. A single figure walked across the lawn, tall, coat dark against the pale morning. Hugh. His stride was steady, his head bowed as though his thoughts were heavier than the fog. For reasons Violet could not explain, watching him stirred something unfamiliar inside her. Not desire, not yet, but recognition. He, too, was trapped by circumstance, living inside walls built by loss. The clock chimed 1. By the time Violet reached the nursery, the children were waiting. Edmund, the elder, stood near the window with his arms crossed, his expression a mirror of his father's, calm surface, restless mind. He was 8, but carried himself like a small soldier, chin lifted, gaze sharp. Beside him sat Clara, 6 years old, pale curls framing a face too serious for her age. She was pretending to sew, but her tiny hands trembled just enough to betray her nervousness. Violet curtsied. "Good afternoon, Master Edmund, Miss Clara. It is a pleasure to meet you." Edmund said nothing. Clara looked up, her blue eyes clear and curious. "You don't look like a governess," she said. Violet smiled faintly. "And how does a governess look?" Clara considered. "Older," she said simply. "That is true," Edmund murmured. "Father hires children to teach children now." "Edmund," Violet said gently, "I am 19, not a child." He turned toward her then, the faintest smirk ghosting across his face. 19 is very young to tell others what to do. Violet's instinct was to retreat, but she stood firm. "Perhaps," she said, "but youth doesn't mean ignorance. Sometimes it means hope." The boy blinked, momentarily disarmed. Clara giggled softly, covering her mouth as if she shouldn't have found it funny. Violet crossed to the table, her movements calm and deliberate. "What lessons were you studying before my arrival?" Edmund shrugged. "Latin, arithmetic, things I already know." "Then we'll begin with something you do not," she replied. "And what would that be?" "How to listen," Violet said simply. The silence that followed was fragile but not hostile. The boy's eyes narrowed, and Violet saw, behind his defensiveness, the reflection of grief. It sat on his shoulders like an inherited burden. After an hour of measured conversation, no lessons, only questions about their interests, Clara began to relax, speaking of her favorite flowers and the pond where she used to play with her mother. Edmund remained guarded, though his tone softened when Violet listened instead of correcting. When the door opened, Hugh stood there. The children turned instantly, Clara's face brightening, Edmund's shoulders squaring. "Papa?" Clara said, running to him. He lifted her effortlessly, pressing a kiss to her temple. His tenderness was quiet, the kind that a man gave only when no one was meant to see. "Have you been good for Miss Ashford?" he asked. Clara nodded. "I think so." Edmund folded his arms. "She talks too much about hope." A ghost of a smile touched Hugh's mouth. He set Clara down and looked at Violet. "Hope is not such a dangerous subject, is it, Miss Ashford?" Her breath caught at the way he said her name, slowly, deliberately, as if tasting the syllables. "Not dangerous," she said softly, "just fragile." Their eyes met, and for a brief, treacherous moment, the world around them blurred. The air seemed to hum with something unspoken, respect, curiosity, longing that neither dared name. Then Hugh cleared his throat and turned to his son. "You will treat Miss Ashford with the same respect you give Mrs. Brimley, am I clear?" "Yes, father." Hugh's gaze lingered once more on Violet. "If you need anything, you may send word through Mrs. Brimley. My office is at the West Wing." "Thank you, my lord," she said, dipping her head. When he left, the air seemed emptier, colder. Violet's hands trembled slightly, though she hid them in the folds of her skirt. Clara studied her wide-eyed. "You like Papa," the girl said suddenly. Violet froze. "He is very kind," she replied carefully. Clara smiled, a child's smile, innocent, unfiltered. "He doesn't smile like that for anyone." "Clara," Edmund warned, glaring at his sister. Violet's lips curved faintly. "I believe your father smiles when you are happy. That is reason enough." Clara looked satisfied. Edmund muttered something under his breath and turned to his books again. As the day faded into dusk, Violet returned to her chamber, exhausted but strangely alive. The house around her seemed to breathe again, faintly, like a creature waking from long sleep. She lit a small candle and opened the window. The evening air carried the scent of damp earth and smoke from distant hearths. She could hear faint voices below, servants preparing supper, footsteps echoing across stone, and then, unmistakably, a man's voice, low, steady, familiar, Hugh's. Violet leaned slightly against the window frame, listening without meaning to. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, something brittle. She could not hear the words, only the sound, command softened by exhaustion. The candle flickered, and her gaze drifted to the gardens where his shadow moved across the path. He paused once, looking toward her window, though he could not possibly see her in the dim light. Still, her heart beat faster, foolishly certain he could feel her eyes on him. For a moment that stretched too long, they both stood in the same silence, separated by glass and distance, but bound by something unnamed. The weight of gratitude, of curiosity, of the strange comfort that came from being seen. When he finally turned and disappeared into the darkness, Violet closed the window, pressing her palm to the cool pane. Aldercombe Manor, she thought, was not dead after all. It was simply holding its breath, waiting for someone brave enough to make it exhale. And somewhere deep inside its stone walls, she felt the first faint echo of belonging. The first days of teaching at Aldercombe unfolded like a delicate battle Violet never expected to fight. Every morning, when she crossed the long corridor that led to the schoolroom, the air itself seemed to tighten in warning. The scent of ink, chalk, and cold stone greeted her like silent adversaries. The children were always waiting, Clara seated neatly at her desk, her doll beside her, and Edmund by the window, his chin lifted as if commanding invisible troops. Outside, the countryside was bright with winter sunlight, but inside the manor, shadows ruled. The tall windows let in light that fell unevenly across the floorboards, dividing the room into stripes of warmth and chill. Violet quickly learned to stand in the light whenever she could. The shadows belonged to the children's mistrust. "Good morning," she greeted them on her third day, her tone calm and even. Edmund did not reply. He dipped his quill into the inkwell and began drawing lines across the page, not letters, just defiant strokes, long and careless. Clara hummed softly, twisting a ribbon between her fingers, eyes wide and innocent. Violet placed her books on the desk and unfolded her notes. "Today, we will review the names of the English counties, beginning from the south." "Clara, can you name one?" Clara wrinkled her nose. "Kent," she said after a pause. "Very good," Violet replied, smiling. "And Edmund?" The boy's quill stopped. He looked at her with clear blue eyes that mirrored his father's cold restraint. "You may continue without me, Miss Ashford. I already know them all." His tone was polite, but the words were a challenge, like a sword drawn quietly. Violet felt the sting of it, yet she refused to retreat. "Then you can assist me," she said. "Tell your sister what county lies north of Kent." He arched a brow. "That would depend, Miss Ashford. Do you mean north by miles or north by virtue?" Clara giggled. Violet almost smiled, despite herself. "Let us say by miles," she answered softly. "Then it would be Surrey," he said quickly, before returning to his page as if to declare victory. Violet allowed herself a breath. "Excellent. Perhaps we will do geography after all." For an hour, she guided them through lessons, spelling, recitation, simple arithmetic. Clara grew comfortable enough to laugh, and even Edmund, when caught by surprise, smiled once before remembering he was meant to dislike her. It was a small victory, fragile as the paper under her hand. When lessons ended, Edmund stood abruptly, closing his book. "You may leave our drawings, Miss Ashford. We prefer to tidy the room ourselves." "That is very kind," she said, though she sensed a trap. She curtsied slightly and stepped away, leaving her papers on the desk. It was not until she returned after luncheon that she saw what he had done. Ink, dark, heavy, deliberate, stained the top of her lesson book. Her careful notes were ruined, the page soaked through with black. Across the edge, in small, neat letters, Edmund had written, "We do not need a new mother." Violet stood still, her throat tightening. The words glistened, fresh and cruel. For a long moment, she could only stare at them, her heart aching not from the insult, but from the grief that bled beneath it. The boy was defending something lost. She took a clean cloth and began to blot the ink, quietly, methodically, refusing to cry. Clara watched from the doorway, her little hands twisting her pinafore. "Edmund didn't mean it," she whispered. "He says it when he's angry." Violet turned to her, her expression gentle. "And what about you, Clara? Are you angry too?" The child hesitated. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "because she's gone and Papa doesn't laugh anymore. The house used to smell of roses. Now it smells of paper and smoke." Violet knelt so their eyes met. "Do you think it could smell of roses again someday?" Clara's voice trembled. "If Papa wanted it to. Then maybe we can help him remember," Violet said softly. At dinner that evening, the household gathered as custom demanded. The candles burned low, flickering against the polished silver. Hugh sat at the head of the table, his posture impeccable, his expression distant. Mrs. Brimley hovered near the servants' entrance, ever watchful. Violet sat quietly, her eyes lowered, aware of every whisper of fabric and the clink of each utensil. The children were unusually silent. Edmund ate without meeting her gaze, and Clara toyed with her spoon. When Hugh finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of habit. "Were the lessons satisfactory today?" "They went well," Violet answered, though her heart still burned with the memory of the ink-stained words. "Good," he said, then glanced toward his son. "Edmund?" The boy hesitated, his fork resting mid-air. "Miss Ashford knows her subjects," he said finally, "though she talks about flowers when she should talk about numbers." Clara giggled. but Hugh's mouth curved in a faint, restrained smile. "Flowers, Miss Ashford." "I find," Violet replied quietly, "that lessons stay longer in the mind when they are tied to beauty." Their eyes met across the table. Something unspoken flickered between them. Approval, admiration, or perhaps something gentler still. Hugh nodded. "Perhaps that is true," he said, "though I cannot recall the last time beauty taught me anything practical." "Perhaps it isn't meant to teach," she said, "only to remind us that we are still alive." The silence that followed was heavy, intimate. Even the candles seemed to burn more slowly. Hugh looked away first, his jaw tightening as if she had touched something raw beneath his composure. After dinner, Violet excused herself to the library to prepare her next day's lessons. The room was enormous, lined from floor to ceiling with books, the scent of leather and old ink filling the air. She found a seat near the fire and began copying exercises into her notebook, the light from the flames painting her face in warm tones. She'd been there nearly half an hour when a soft sound startled her, a door closing behind her. She turned and saw Hugh standing near the entrance, a candle holder in his hand. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "Not at all, my lord," she replied, setting her quill aside. "I was preparing for tomorrow." He moved closer, the candlelight catching the sharp lines of his face. "You work late." "It helps me think," she said. His gaze fell to the ink on her fingers. "You've had some trouble today." Her breath caught. Yes, a small incident." "With Edmund?" Violet hesitated. "Children act from pain, not malice. He misses his mother." Hugh's face darkened with something that was not anger but sorrow. "You are perceptive, Miss Ashford. Too perceptive, perhaps." "I only wish to help them," she said softly. "And you will," he replied, though his voice carried more weariness than certainty. "But do not take their words to heart. They are not meant for you." Violet looked down. "I know, but still, they sting." Hugh's hand flexed slightly at his side, as though he wanted to reach for her and did not dare. "You are not the first person this house has wounded," he said after a pause. "Aldercombe holds on to its ghosts." "Then perhaps it is time someone opened the windows," she said quietly. He stared at her for a long moment, the corners of his mouth softening. "You speak boldly for someone who has just arrived." "Only because no one else seems to," she answered, her voice trembling with restrained courage. He stepped closer and Violet felt her pulse quicken. The air between them changed, dense, electric, unsteady. His eyes, so often cold, were gentler now, touched by something almost human. "Do you know," he said quietly, "that no one has spoken to me that way in years?" "Perhaps they should," she whispered. For a heartbeat, the silence was unbearable. She could feel the heat of the fire against her skin, hear the ticking of the clock, the faint crackle of burning logs. Hugh's gaze moved to her lips, then back to her eyes. "I should let you rest," he said finally, the words forced through restraint. "Good night, Miss Ashford." "Good night, my lord," she murmured, her voice barely audible. When he left, the door closed softly behind him, yet the echo lingered like the aftertaste of something forbidden. Violet pressed her hands together, her heart trembling with confusion. She had not meant to speak to him so boldly. She had not meant to feel anything at all. The next morning, she entered the schoolroom to find the ink stain gone. Edmund sat stiffly at his desk, his quill poised, his eyes avoiding hers. "I cleaned it," he muttered without looking up. Violet paused, her throat tightening. "That was thoughtful of you, Edmund." "Thank you." He shrugged. "It was ugly." "Sometimes," she said gently, "ugly things can be forgiven." Clara smiled from her corner, and for the first time, the schoolroom did not feel entirely like a battlefield. That night, as Violet walked down the corridor toward her room, she passed the library again. A faint glow of lamplight shone beneath the door. She hesitated, then continued on, but before she turned the corner, she looked back. Through the crack, she could see Hugh standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out into the darkness. His reflection shimmered faintly against the glass. Tall, solitary, burdened, Violet watched him for one quiet moment before whispering to herself, "He carries the world alone." And though she had come to this house as nothing but a governess, something within her began to stir, a tenderness she had no right to feel, and yet could not resist. Sunday dawned pale and hushed, as though even the wind feared to disturb the sanctity of the Sabbath. The bells of the village church tolled softly in the distance, their sound travelling through the cold air and settling gently over the Cotswolds hills. Inside Aldecombe Manor, the morning began with quiet ritual, silver polished, boots brushed, ribbons tied, and hearts steeled for public scrutiny. Violet stood by her small window, fastening the last pearl button of her cream pelisse. The fabric was modest but finely cut, borrowed from Mrs. Brimley's careful generosity. Beneath it, her simple muslin gown peaked at the collar, and a small bonnet framed her face. She had braided her chestnut hair into a smooth knot, though a few strands refused obedience and curved softly along her cheeks. Her reflection in the glass seemed foreign, too composed for the uncertainty that trembled inside her. This would be her first public appearance since the auction, and though she had done nothing wrong, she knew how swiftly gossip could invent sins for any woman who stood beside power. A knock at her door startled her. When she turned, Hugh Weatherby stood at the threshold, impeccably dressed in dark coat and cravat, his gloved hand resting against the doorframe. The light from the corridor framed him in soft gold, turning his serious face almost tender. "Are the children ready?" he asked, his tone formal, but his eyes lingered on her longer than decorum allowed. "They are," Violet replied. Clara insisted on arranging her bonnet herself, though Edmund found the task beneath his dignity. That earned the faintest curve of a smile from him, an expression so rare it might have been mistaken for sunlight breaking through cloud. "He sounds very much like his father at that age," he said. Violet hesitated. "And now?" His eyes met hers. "Now he's worse." She could not help but laugh softly. The sound escaped her like a sigh of relief. It startled him, that laughter. He looked at her as though he had forgotten what it felt like to make someone smile. When she lowered her gaze, the silence that followed was gentle, almost companionable. Hugh cleared his throat. "We should not keep the congregation waiting." The carriage ride to the church was quiet, filled with the creak of leather and the rhythmic clatter of wheels over frost. The countryside passed by in subdued tones, bare trees etched against a grey sky, smoke rising from chimneys, a few villagers walking along the lane. Clara sat beside Violet, her gloved hand tucked securely into the governess's. Edmund faced forward, eyes on the horizon, every inch the future marquess. Hugh sat across from them, his gaze occasionally drifting toward Violet before he forced it away. When the church steeple came into view, Violet's chest tightened. The stone walls gleamed faintly in the winter light, surrounded by gravestones like silent sentinels. As they stepped out of the carriage, heads began to turn. The villagers, gathered in small groups by the entrance, paused their conversations. Whispers fluttered like invisible birds. "That's her," someone murmured. "The governess? The one he brought home from—" "Shh! He'll hear you." Violet's cheeks warmed, but she kept her posture straight. She had endured humiliation before. This was only its polished cousin. Hugh offered her his arm, a gesture of propriety that ignited a wave of speculation among the onlookers. She hesitated, aware that every eye was fixed upon them. "My lord," she whispered, "it may draw attention." "They already stare," he said quietly. "Better they see respect than rumour." She placed her hand lightly upon his sleeve. The contact was barely a touch, yet she felt its weight everywhere, steady, firm, protective. Inside, the church smelled of beeswax and cold stone. Candles flickered along the altar, casting long shadows that seemed to breathe with the prayers of centuries. Violet sat with the children in the front pew, Hugh beside them. The minister began his sermon about mercy, but Violet heard little of it. Her mind was too aware of the world around her, the shifting of skirts, the rustle of hymnals, the soft coughs behind gloved hands. When she dared glance at Hugh, she found him watching her, not boldly, but with quiet intensity, as though he were studying something he could not name. His gaze lingered just long enough for her heart to forget its rhythm. After the service, they walked out together into the thin winter sunlight. A few villagers offered polite smiles, others avoided meeting their eyes. Violet felt the familiar ache of judgment pressing against her spine. Then, as they reached the edge of the churchyard, a man's voice, coarse, emboldened by gossip, cut through the still air. "Generous of the marquess, isn't it?" he said loudly to his companion. "Saving one girl, bringing her home, perhaps saving himself the cost of another." Laughter followed, sharp and cruel. Violet froze, her hand slipping from Hugh's arm. Shame and fury burned through her, though she had done nothing to deserve either. Before she could move, Hugh turned. His eyes darkened, not with anger alone, but with something deeper, colder. He strode toward the man, each step deliberate. The crowd quieted instantly, their whispers dying into breathless silence. "I beg your pardon," Hugh said, his voice low and steady. "I seem to have misheard you." The man, pale now, fumbled with his hat. "My lord, I meant no offense." "You did," Hugh interrupted softly, "and you will remember it." His words were not loud, but they carried the full weight of power. "If I ever hear my name or hers on your tongue again, I will not be so forgiving." The man stammered something that might have been an apology. Hugh said nothing more. He turned back to Violet, who stood motionless, her eyes wide. "Come," he said gently. She obeyed, her pulse racing as they walked toward the carriage. The villagers parted like water, clearing a silent path. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Clara clung to Violet's hand, frightened by what she did not understand. Edmund stared at his father with a mix of awe and confusion. Violet spoke first, her voice quiet. "You should not have done that." "I should have done worse," he replied. "You have given them reason to speak again," she whispered. "And they will. They always do." Hugh turned toward her. "Let them," he said simply. "Their words have power only if we bow to them." Violet's throat tightened. "You think I am strong enough to ignore it?" His gaze softened. "I think you have already proven you are." The way he looked at her then, steady, unflinching, made her feel seen in a way that frightened her more than any gossip ever could. The ride home passed in silence, but it was not the silence of discomfort. It was heavy, meaningful, alive. When the carriage stopped at the manor gates, Hugh stepped out first, then turned to offer her his hand. She hesitated only a moment before placing hers in his. His gloved fingers closed around hers, warm and firm, sending a quiet shiver through her. That evening the house seemed restless. Mrs. Brimley's disapproval hung in the air like a scent that could not be masked. The servants moved quickly, whispering as they passed. Even the children sensed it. After supper, Edmund approached Violet in the schoolroom. "They're saying things about you," he muttered. "I know," she said gently. "They're saying you've made Father angry." "I haven't made him angry," she replied. "He defended what was right." Edmund frowned. "Father doesn't defend people. He doesn't even defend himself." Violet smiled faintly. Perhaps he remembers how. The boy studied her for a moment, then left without another word. When the house finally quieted, Violet stepped out into the corridor, drawn by the glow spilling from the study at the far end. The door was half open. She hesitated, then knocked softly. "Come in," Hugh's voice called. He sat by the hearth, still dressed from the day, though his cravat was loosened and fatigue shadowed his face. A glass of untouched brandy rested on the table beside him. The firelight softened his features, revealing the man beneath the title. Violet stood in the doorway, uncertain. "I wish to thank you," she said. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "For what?" "For defending me. For seeing me when others refused." His gaze held hers. "You should not have needed my defense," he said quietly. This village was supposed to be my refuge, but it is full of small cruelties. I will not allow them to touch you." Her breath trembled. "You cannot protect me from everything." "No," he admitted, "but I can try." She took a step closer, drawn as though by gravity. "And who protects you, my lord?" For the first time, something broke through his composure. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "No one, but I have learned to live without it." Violet's heart ached at the loneliness in his tone. She dared another step forward, her voice soft. "Perhaps you shouldn't have to." He turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes again. The fire flickered between them, the air trembling with unspoken emotion. His gaze moved to her lips, then back to her face. "Miss Ashford," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "You make it difficult to remember who I am." "Perhaps," she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "You only need to remember who you wish to be." For a moment the room held its breath. The distance between them felt as fragile as spun glass. Then Hugh drew in a sharp breath and stood, forcing a measure of control back into his posture. "You should rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow will bring its own battles." Violet nodded, her pulse still unsteady. "Good night, my lord." He inclined his head. "Good night, Miss Ashford." As she turned to leave, he spoke again, softer this time, almost as if to himself. "You have changed the silence of this house." She paused at the door, her eyes glistening. Then perhaps the silence was ready to be changed. When she left, the echo of her footsteps faded slowly down the corridor. Hugh remained by the fire, staring at the empty doorway, his hand still resting where hers had brushed it moments earlier. Outside, the wind stirred through the bare trees, carrying with it the sound of the church bells in the distance, faint, solemn, and strangely hopeful. And within the great honeystone walls of Aldecombe, the first fragile seeds of love began to take root, trembling, stubborn, and alive. The morning after the church incident arrived with a deceptive calm. The frost that had blanketed the hills glittered beneath a weak sun, the kind that offered light but no warmth. Inside Aldecombe Manor, the world appeared unchanged. Fires burned in the hearths, servants hurried through their duties, and the sound of distant laughter from the children's corridor floated faintly through the halls. Yet beneath that fragile routine, something invisible had shifted. Violet felt it the moment she entered the breakfast room. The servants greeted her with polite restraint instead of warmth, their eyes lingering a heartbeat too long. Mrs. Brimley, though courteous, avoided meeting her gaze. Even Edmund, seated stiffly beside his sister, seemed quieter, his expression watchful. The whispers from the village had made their way to the manor, curling through corridors like smoke. Hugh sat at the head of the table, a newspaper folded in his hands. He looked composed, yet Violet sensed the tension beneath his stillness. His cravat was tied with immaculate precision, his dark coat perfectly pressed, but his jaw carried the faint shadow of a sleepless night. When she entered, he rose slightly, an automatic gesture of respect that made her pulse flutter. "Good morning, Miss Ashford." "Good morning, my lord," she replied softly, curtsying before taking her place beside the children. For a time, the room filled with only the quiet sounds of breakfast, the gentle clink of silverware, the rustle of pages, the faint crackle of the fire. Then Clara spoke, her voice timid but bright. "Papa, Lady Mercer is coming today." Violet glanced up, startled. Hugh's gaze lifted from his paper, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features before he smoothed it away. "Yes," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "She wrote to request an audience regarding the charitable committee for the parish. I saw no reason to decline." Edmund smirked faintly. "She never comes to discuss charity." "Edmund," Hugh warned, though his voice held little force. Clara looked between them with childlike curiosity. "Does Lady Mercer like us, Papa?" Hugh hesitated, then said simply, "She likes the idea of us." Violet lowered her eyes to hide the small smile that threatened her composure. She had not met Lady Mercer, but she had heard the name spoken in the village with a mixture of admiration and envy. A widow of wealth and influence, she was known for her refined beauty and her skill in turning gossip into power. When the meal ended, Hugh stood. "Miss Ashford, I will ask that the children remain in the nursery this afternoon during Lady Mercer's visit. I trust that will not inconvenience you." "Of course not," Violet said. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, unreadable. "Thank you." When he left, Clara whispered, "Lady Mercer smells like roses." Edmund rolled his eyes. "She smells like trouble." By noon, the grand drawing room had been transformed. Fresh flowers adorned the mantel, and sunlight filtered through the tall windows, gilding the edges of the furniture. Violet passed through the corridor, carrying the children's lesson books, and paused near the open doors. She had not meant to linger, but voices drifted outward, rich and melodious. "Dearest Hugh," came a woman's voice, smooth and practiced, every syllable dripping with genteel sweetness. "How very lonely this house must have been without company of your own kind." "Company," Hugh replied evenly, "is not measured by birth, Lady Mercer, but by sincerity." A soft laugh followed. "Oh, my dear Marquis, you have grown philosophical. Grief often does that to the best of men. Still, the villagers talk, you know. They worry about you, about the sort of influence to which your children are exposed." Violet froze. Lady Mercer's tone was tender, but beneath it lay steel. "You are too generous, too trusting, bringing a young woman of no background to live under your roof. Surely you must see how it appears." There was a silence long enough for Violet to feel her own heartbeat. Then Hugh's voice came, calm but edged. "Appearances concern me far less than intentions, madam, and Miss Ashford's intentions, unlike most, are entirely pure." "Are you certain?" Lady Mercer asked softly. "Men in your position rarely see the full picture until it is too late." Violet stepped back from the door, breath trembling. She had no wish to overhear more. Her heart pounded as she hurried down the corridor, clutching her books to her chest. The words stung, not because they surprised her, but because they confirmed what she already feared, that kindness would never shield her from suspicion. That afternoon, she devoted herself to the children with fierce determination. Clara painted at the window, her curls falling into her face, while Edmund copied Latin sentences with stubborn concentration. Violet's voice remained gentle, her smile steady, but every moment felt like a test of endurance. When the lesson ended, Edmund looked up from his work. "Father didn't come to see us today." "He is busy," Violet said. "With Lady Mercer." "Yes," she admitted quietly. The boy frowned. "I don't like her. She looks at father the way people look at gold." Violet met his eyes, surprised by his clarity. "You're very perceptive, Edmund." He shrugged. "I notice things." He hesitated, then added, "She won't like you." Violet's hands stilled. "That is not her concern." "It will be," he said softly. Later, when the sun had begun its slow descent, Violet ventured into the library to return a volume Hugh had lent her, a book of poetry she had read in the solitude of her room. She placed it carefully on his desk, intending to leave at once, but paused when the door opened behind her. "Miss Ashford!" She turned, startled. Hugh stood there, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes betrayed fatigue. The faintest trace of rose perfume clung to the air around him, a scent too rich, too practiced to be his own. "My lord," she said quietly, "I did not mean to intrude." "You never intrude," he replied. His voice was low, roughened by something she could not name. "I wish to return your book." He nodded, stepping closer. "Did you enjoy it?" "Very much," she said, "though I fear I understand only half of what it means." He smiled faintly. "That is the nature of poetry. It hides its truth until one is ready to hear it." Violet hesitated. "I believe it also reflects the heart of the one who reads it." Hugh's gaze deepened. "Then tell me, what did it show you?" Her breath caught. "Loneliness," she said softly, "and hope." For a long moment, He said nothing. The fire crackled gently behind him, its light touching the planes of his face, softening the severity of his expression. "Hope," he repeated. "A dangerous thing to find in my house." "Perhaps not dangerous," she whispered. "Only necessary." The silence between them thickened, charged with everything neither dared confess. His eyes lowered briefly to her hands, slender and trembling against the folds of her gown, then returned to her face. "Lady Mercer spoke of you," he said finally. Violet stiffened. "I suspected as much." "She does not understand compassion without motive," Hugh continued, his tone calm but cold. "She believes that every act of kindness must conceal ambition." "And what do you believe, my lord?" He met her gaze directly. "I believe she is wrong." Her heart stuttered, her voice barely a whisper. "And if she were right? Then I would still rather be deceived by goodness than protected by cynicism," he said. Violet's throat tightened. The honesty in his tone felt dangerous. It made her want to trust him, to believe in something beyond survival. "Thank you," she murmured, "for defending me." "You need not thank me for seeing the truth," he said quietly. "Even when the truth costs you your reputation." He took another step toward her, close enough that she could feel the faint warmth of his breath. "Reputation is a fragile thing, Miss Ashford. It bends to whispers. Character does not." Her heart trembled beneath her bodice. "And what of compassion?" His eyes softened, though his voice dropped to a murmur. "That too can endure." They stood there, motionless, two souls bound by the gravity of what remained unsaid. Violet felt the world narrowing to the space between them, the scent of smoke and paper, the faint hum of the fire, the rhythm of her own heartbeat filling the silence. Then Hugh turned away abruptly, his control snapping back like a curtain drawn too quickly. "I have a meeting with the steward," he said. "You should rest." "Yes, my lord," she whispered, though she did not move. As he reached the door, he paused. Without looking back, he said, "Do not let her words trouble you. Lady Mercer thrives on fear. Deny her that pleasure." When he was gone, Violet sank into the chair by the fire, her fingers pressing against her lips as if to quiet the storm inside her. She had thought herself strong, untouchable, but the memory of his voice, steady, protective, and unbearably tender, undid her. That night, sleep refused her. The house lay silent, wrapped in the cold hush of winter. From her window, she could see the faint light of the library still burning, a soft glow against the darkness. She imagined him there, alone among his papers, his mind burdened by duty and ghosts. For reasons she could not name, Violet whispered into the quiet, "You are not alone, my lord." The words vanished into the night, carried by the wind across the frost-covered fields. Downstairs, Hugh stood at his desk, staring at the dying fire. He had tried to dismiss her from his thoughts, but her voice, her defiance, her quiet grace, all of it haunted him like a melody that refused to fade. When the candle finally flickered out, he closed his eyes and whispered her name so softly that not even the shadows dared to answer. The afternoon began with a calm so fragile it felt like glass waiting to break. Outside Aldecombe Manor, the sky darkened by slow degrees, clouds gathering with the weight of a promise unspoken. The scent of rain moved through the air, clean, electric, and full of warning. Inside, the house felt unusually still, as though it too were holding its breath. Violet sensed the storm before she heard it. She had been sitting with Clara in the nursery, mending the hem of the child's pinafore, while Edmund constructed a fortress from wooden blocks near the hearth. The faint glow of fire danced along the walls, painting the children's faces in tones of amber and gold. It should have been a peaceful afternoon, but the tension in the house lingered like perfume after an unwelcome guest. The memory of Lady Mercer's visit had not faded. Servants whispered in corners, Mrs. Brimley's glances had grown tighter, and Violet could feel the echo of judgment in every hallway. She bore it silently, knowing words would only give the rumours shape. But what she could not bear was the thought that the children might suffer for it. Clara hummed softly, her voice trembling like the wings of a bird. "Miss Ashford, Do storms frighten you? Violet smiled faintly, though her needle paused in her hand. Only a little. But I think storms are rather like people. They make noise when they can no longer keep quiet. Clara considered that, her small fingers twisting the lace trim of her doll's dress. Then Papa must be a storm. Violet's heart softened. Why do you say that, darling? Because he's quiet most of the time, the child whispered, but when he looks sad, I can almost hear thunder. Violet's throat tightened. Perhaps thunder is not always anger. Sometimes it's just the sky missing the sun. The first crack of thunder arrived then, deep and distant, rolling over the hills like a growl from the heavens. The rain followed swiftly, heavy, sudden, relentless, tapping against the tall nursery windows with wild insistence. Clara jumped, her doll falling from her lap. Edmund looked up from his blocks, expression unreadable, though his hand clenched around one piece until his knuckles paled. "It's only rain," Violet said gently, setting aside her sewing. "Nothing to fear." But as the wind howled against the panes, Clara's face went white. She pressed her palms over her ears and whimpered, "Make it stop, please make it stop." Violet was on her feet in an instant, kneeling beside her. "Clara, look at me," she said softly. "Breathe, my dear. In and out, just like this." The child shook her head, her breaths coming short and fast. "It sounds like the night Mama went away," she cried. "The thunder came then too." Violet froze. Her heart broke for the small, trembling body before her, for the memories she had never intended to awaken. She glanced at Edmund, whose jaw had set in an expression far too old for his years. He stood rigid, his eyes glistening, though he would never allow tears to fall. "Clara," Violet whispered, pulling the girl gently into her arms. "You're safe. You're safe, my darling. The storm cannot touch you here." Still, Clara clung to her tightly, sobbing into the folds of Violet's gown. Each rumble of thunder sent another shiver through her. The doll lay forgotten on the rug. The door opened suddenly. Hugh stood there, his dark coat dusted with raindrops, his expression stricken as he took in the scene. For the briefest instant, the mask he wore before the world slipped away, revealing something raw and unguarded beneath. "What happened?" His voice was tight, his eyes flicking from his daughter's trembling form to Violet's calm, steady hands. "She's frightened," Violet said gently. "The storm reminds her of—" "I know," he interrupted softly, and his voice broke on the words. He stepped closer, then stopped as though uncertain. Violet could see it, the helplessness of a man who commanded everything except the one thing that mattered. She rose slightly, still cradling Clara, and whispered, "Sit here. She'll listen to you." Hugh obeyed without hesitation. He lowered himself into the armchair near the fire, and Violet guided Clara toward him. The little girl resisted at first, but when her father's arms enveloped her, the trembling began to ease. Hugh held her close, murmuring softly, words Violet could barely hear, words not meant for anyone else. Violet turned away, giving them privacy, though her eyes burned with unshed tears. She watched Edmund instead, who had retreated to the far side of the room, pretending to rearrange his blocks, though his movements were clumsy. Distracted. "Edmund," she said quietly, "you don't have to be brave all the time." He stiffened. "I'm not frightened." "I didn't say you were," she replied. "But you're allowed to miss her too." The boy's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment Violet thought he would turn away again, but then he looked up, and the fragility in his gaze cut through her heart. "Papa doesn't like to talk about her," he said. "So I don't either." Violet nodded, her voice soft. "Sometimes silence is a way to keep love alive, but sometimes it keeps it locked away, where no one can reach it." He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a stranger in his mother's place, but as someone who understood. Behind them, Hugh's voice faltered. Clara had fallen asleep against his chest, her small fingers still clutching his coat. His eyes met Violet's across the room, and something passed between them. Gratitude, exhaustion, a thread of tenderness too powerful to name. "She should rest in her bed," Violet said softly. Hugh nodded. "I'll carry her." He rose carefully, his daughter nestled in his arms. For a moment the sight of him, strong and gentle, burdened yet full of love, made Violet's breath catch. The storm outside raged louder, thunder cracking like a drumbeat, but within that small room there was only warmth and quiet strength. When he returned, his hair slightly damp from the rain that had found him on his way upstairs, Violet was tidying the nursery. He paused at the doorway, watching her in silence. The firelight gilded her figure, catching in the loose strands of her hair. She looked up, startled, her cheeks flushed. "She's sleeping," he said. "Good," Violet replied softly. "She was very frightened." "I know," he murmured. "It was the same the night her mother—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "I could not help her then either." Violet stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You help her every day simply by being here. You are her world, my lord." He shook his head, his expression bleak. "Her world is full of ghosts, and I cannot seem to banish them." Violet hesitated. "Perhaps ghosts cannot be banished, only understood." He looked at her sharply. "And what of yours, Miss Ashford? Do you understand them?" The question struck deep. For a moment she could not speak. "I try to," she said finally, "but understanding does not make them disappear." Hugh studied her face, his gaze searching. "You are not what I expected," he said softly. "And what did you expect, my lord?" "Someone weaker," he admitted. "Someone who would bow beneath the weight of this house." "Then you misjudged me," she whispered. "I am used to carrying more than I can bear." His lips curved faintly, though sorrow shadowed the gesture. "Yes," he said, "I see that now." The fire crackled between them, its light flickering over his face. He took a step closer, not enough to be improper, but enough for Violet to feel the warmth of him. The air seemed to hum with tension, sweet, dangerous, alive. "You've done something I could not," he said quietly. "You made her feel safe." "Children trust kindness," Violet murmured. "They see it when adults forget how." He exhaled, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then I have forgotten too much." Violet's heart trembled. "You could remember, if you wished to." Their gazes locked, and the world outside seemed to vanish. The thunder, the rain, even the house itself. She could hear nothing but the sound of her own breath, fast and shallow, and the steady beat of her heart echoing in her ears. "Miss Ashford," Hugh said softly, almost reverently, "every time I look at you, I am reminded of what I once promised myself, to never feel again." Violet's voice was barely a whisper. "And do you regret remembering?" He hesitated. "Not yet." The thunder crashed again, startling them both back into themselves. He stepped back slightly, his composure returning like a mask he had worn for too long. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "This house makes it easy to forget propriety." "There is nothing to forgive," she replied. He inclined his head, though his eyes betrayed a storm fiercer than the one outside. "You should rest. The storm will pass soon." Violet nodded. "Good night, my lord." "Good night, Miss Ashford." She turned toward the door, but before leaving she glanced back. He still stood near the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze distant. For a moment she thought of how easily one heart could misstep when shadowed by loneliness. As she walked down the corridor, the rain softened to a steady rhythm, the kind that lulled the world to sleep. Yet sleep did not come easily for Violet that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, his arms around his child, his voice low and trembling, his eyes meeting hers across the firelight. Outside, thunder rolled once more, softer now, like a sigh of surrender, and within the walls of Aldercombe, two hearts beat quietly in the dark, separate yet already bound by something neither of them dared to name. The snow had come without warning, transforming Aldercombe into a world of white and silence. The gardens, once alive with roses and lavender, lay buried beneath a soft shroud of frost. The sky was pale, the color of porcelain, and the air so still that even the crows dared not speak. Violet stood by the nursery window that morning, watching the snowfall as she wrapped Clara's shawl around her shoulders. The girl giggled softly, pressing her hand to the cold glass. "It looks like sugar," she whispered. "It does," Violet said gently, "though not nearly as sweet." Edmund, seated by the fire, looked up from his book. "Father says snow hides more than it reveals. He says beauty can be dangerous when it blinds you." Violet smiled faintly. "Your father is wise, though I think he forgets that beauty can also heal." The boy frowned, as though uncertain whether to argue. He did not reply, but Violet caught the way his gaze softened toward the window, following the quiet drift of flakes that fell like blessings. By midday, the world outside was wrapped in white silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the nursery with warmth, and Violet's thoughts wandered to the man who had changed her life without meaning to. She had tried to push his image from her mind. The quiet authority in his voice, the storm behind his eyes, the rare, fleeting warmth of his smile. But Hugh Weatherby had become as constant as the winter wind. It was just after noon when Mrs. Brimley entered, her hands folded primly before her. "Miss Ashford," she said with careful politeness, "His lordship requests your presence in the garden conservatory." Violet blinked. "The garden? In this weather?" "He insists," the housekeeper replied, her expression unreadable. "He said it was a matter of importance." Violet hesitated, then nodded. "I'll come at once." She wrapped herself in her heavy cloak, the deep green fabric trimmed with simple fur, and followed Mrs. Brimley through the long corridor. The house felt different now, hushed, reverent, as though it sensed that something was about to change. When she reached the conservatory, the scent of damp earth and faint roses greeted her. The glass ceiling above was veiled with snow, muting the winter light into a pearly glow. The air inside was warmer than she expected, filled with the quiet sound of dripping water. Hugh stood near the far end, his dark figure framed by the pale light. He wore no gloves, and his breath misted faintly in the chill. When he turned, the sight of him, so composed and yet so utterly human, sent a quiet tremor through her. "My lord," Violet said softly, curtsying, "you wished to see me." He nodded, though his expression was difficult to read. "I did. I thought perhaps the quiet of this place might allow us to speak freely." Violet's pulse quickened. "About what, my lord?" "About what cannot remain unspoken any longer," he said quietly. The words hung between them like the echo of a bell. Violet's hands tightened around the folds of her cloak, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. Hugh took a step closer, his gaze steady, though his voice carried a note of hesitation. "You have been here for many weeks now. In that time, you have changed this house in ways I cannot begin to describe. The children laugh again. The silence no longer feels suffocating, and I—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "I find myself thinking of things I had long since buried." Violet's breath trembled. "My lord, Please," he said, his tone soft but urgent. "Do not call me that now. Not when I am trying to be honest." Her eyes widened and she whispered, "Hugh." He closed his eyes briefly, as though the sound of his name from her lips was too much to bear. When he opened them again, his expression had softened. "You have been patient with me, Violet, kinder than I deserved. But you must know the danger of such kindness. It invites feeling where none should exist." Her pulse raced. "You think me unaware of that danger?" she asked, her voice barely more than breath. "I think you far too brave to admit it," he said. A long silence followed, broken only by the faint patter of melting snow against the glass. Violet could not move, could not speak. She wanted to run, to stay, to breathe, and not breathe at once. Finally, she said softly, "You mistake gratitude for affection, Hugh. What you feel is only the reflection of what you've lost." He shook his head. "No, gratitude fades, Violet. This, whatever it is, grows stronger each day." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "And what of the children, of the world that watches every step you take?" His expression darkened. "Do you think I care for gossip?" "You should," she whispered, "because I must. I cannot afford to be careless." "My name would not survive a whisper of scandal," He stepped closer, and she felt the warmth of him even through the cold air. "And mine? Yours would survive anything," she said bitterly. "You are a marquess. I am only what the world will let me be." Hugh's hand twitched at his side, as though he longed to reach for her but could not. "You think I have power, Violet. But what use is power when it cannot mend the heart, when it cannot bring peace to one's own home?" Her voice trembled. "You have peace now." "No," he said softly. "Not peace, only longing." The words struck her like the breaking of glass. She turned away, unable to bear the weight of his gaze. Through the fogged panes, she saw the white blur of snow falling beyond the glass, endless and soundless. "I cannot," she said finally. "You know I cannot." He moved closer still, until she could feel his breath against the nape of her neck. He did not touch her, but the nearness alone made her shiver. "Then tell me how to stop," he murmured. Her eyes fluttered closed. "If I knew, I would have done so already." For a long moment, neither moved. The air was thick with all they could not say, all that propriety forbade, but hearts demanded. Then Hugh stepped back, his composure returning with visible effort. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "You deserve better than to be caught in the ruins of another's grief." Violet turned to face him, her voice breaking. "Don't you see? It is not ruin I see when I look at you. It is life beginning again." His breath caught, but he did not answer. For a moment they stood there, two souls suspended between past and future, between duty and desire. The spell was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps. Mrs. Brimley appeared at the door, her face pale. "My lord," she said quickly, "a messenger has arrived from Bath. He says it concerns your estate." Hugh straightened at once, his voice steady, though his eyes still burned with what had just passed. "Very well. Tell him I will come at once." Mrs. Brimley hesitated, her gaze flicking briefly toward Violet before she curtsied and departed. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. "You should return to the children," Hugh said finally, his voice distant now. "It will be a long afternoon." Violet nodded, gathering her composure with what dignity she could. "Yes, She stopped herself, forcing the word away. "Yes, Hugh." He closed his eyes for a moment, as though her voice had undone him all over again. "Go," he whispered. She turned and walked toward the door, her steps slow, each one a battle against the ache in her chest. As she reached the threshold, his voice stopped her once more. "Violet." She looked back. He stood in the fading light, his dark figure framed by the snow-veiled glass. "Whatever comes, remember this," he said quietly. "You have brought warmth to a place that had forgotten what it felt like." Her throat constricted. "And you," she whispered, "have reminded me what it means to be seen." Then she was gone, her cloak sweeping across the tiled floor, leaving only the faint scent of lavender behind. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and endless. Hugh stood motionless, staring through the glass until her figure vanished from sight. His hand brushed the frost from the window pane, tracing the outline her reflection had left. For the first time in years, he felt the sting of tears. In her chamber, Violet sat before the small mirror, her hands trembling as she untied her bonnet. The faint color on her cheeks betrayed the storm within. She could still feel his nearness, the warmth of his breath, the unspoken plea in his voice. She pressed her fingers to her heart and whispered, "Foolish heart, be still." But even as she spoke, she knew it would not obey. Outside, the storm deepened, blanketing the gardens in silence. And though miles of propriety and fear now stood between them, Violet and Hugh each lay awake that night beneath the same roof, haunted by the same truth, that love, once born, does not wait for permission to live. The storm had passed, but its silence lingered. The snow around Aldecombe Manor gleamed like marble under the pale winter sun, and yet inside the great house the air felt heavier than ever. The corridors carried a strange stillness, one that spoke not of peace, but of waiting. Servants moved more quietly than usual, and even the firelight seemed subdued, as though the walls themselves were holding secrets too delicate to name. Violet walked through those halls with measured grace, her heart burdened by the memory of the conversation in the conservatory. Every word Hugh had spoken replayed in her mind, like the refrain of a song that would not fade. She had told herself that distance was safety, that her purpose here was the children, not her own heart. But reason and feeling had ceased to speak the same language. That morning, Mrs. Brimley found her arranging lessons in the schoolroom. "Miss Ashford," the housekeeper said, her tone brisk but not unkind, "His lordship asks that you see to the children early today. He will be occupied with estate matters this afternoon." Violet looked up. Of course, but she could not help wondering what those estate matters were, or whether they had anything to do with the messenger from Bath who had come the previous day. The uncertainty made her restless. By late afternoon, the light had faded to gold. The children, their lessons complete, had gone to the nursery to play. Clara had left behind a ribbon, violet in colour, lying like a small forgotten promise upon the desk. Violet tucked it gently into her pocket before leaving the room. She wandered without direction, drawn by the soft glow of the setting sun filtering through the west windows. Her steps carried her toward a part of the house she rarely visited, the portrait gallery. It was a long corridor lined with the faces of Weatherby's past, their painted eyes watching her as she entered. The air smelled faintly of dust and oil paint, mingled with the chill of stone. At the far end of the gallery stood a large portrait, draped with a black cloth. The sight of it stirred something deep within her. She had seen the painting once before, briefly, when Clara had pointed it out and whispered, "Mamma?" Violet hesitated, then reached out and lifted the cloth. Lady Weatherby's face emerged from the shadows. A woman of striking beauty, her expression serene and sorrowful, her eyes painted the same pale blue as Clara's. She wore a gown of silver-grey silk, and around her neck glimmered a string of pearls. The artist had captured her with heartbreaking delicacy, as if aware he was immortalizing not a person, but a ghost. Violet stood in silence, gazing at the portrait. "You were loved," she whispered, "and yet he has not forgiven himself for losing you." A voice came from behind her. "I see she has found another confidant." Violet turned sharply. Hugh stood at the threshold, his dark coat still dusted with snow. The waning light touched the edges of his hair, turning it almost bronze. His eyes, when they met hers, were unreadable. "My lord," she said, her pulse quickening, "I didn't mean to intrude." He stepped closer, his gaze lingering on the unveiled portrait. "You have not intruded. She's been silent company for too long." Violet lowered her eyes. "She was beautiful." "She was," he agreed softly, "and unhappy. I did not see it until it was too late." The confession hung in the air like the final note of a requiem. Violet hesitated, then said, "Grief has many forms, my lord. Some build walls to survive it, others carry it like armor." Hugh's mouth curved into a faint, sad smile. "And which have I done?" "Both," she replied gently. "You built your walls so high that even your own heart cannot climb them." He regarded her for a long moment. "And you, Miss Ashford, do you make a habit of studying broken men?" Her voice was steady but soft. "Only those who try to hide their kindness beneath sorrow." He looked away then, as though her words had struck something deep. For a long while neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of wind pressing against the windows. Finally, Hugh said quietly, "She died here, you know, in this very room. She came to the gallery to watch the snow fall and never rose again. Pneumonia, the physician said, but I believe her heart gave out long before." Violet's breath caught. "I am sorry." He turned toward her, and for the first time she saw not the marquess, but the man beneath, the one who had carried years of guilt in silence. "I thought if I kept the house exactly as she left it, if I lived as she had lived, perhaps her absence would hurt less. But all it did was turn this place into her tomb. Violet took a slow step forward, her voice trembling. "And yet you remain here." "Yes," he said, "because I did not know how to leave." The dying light from the windows fell across his face, and Violet saw the exhaustion there, the loneliness of a man who had given everything to duty and lost himself in the process. "You could still begin again," she said softly. His eyes met hers. "With what?" "The world expects me to mourn her forever. Anything less would be betrayal." "And what does your heart expect?" He did not answer. Instead, he walked closer, his gaze locked on hers. "My heart has no right to expect anything," he said at last. She felt the air grow taut between them, charged with something fragile and unspoken. "Hearts," she whispered, "rarely obey reason." Hugh stopped before her, so near that she could feel the warmth of him. The faint scent of snow and pine clung to his coat. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. "You make it sound simple," he murmured. "Nothing about this is simple," she replied, her voice breaking slightly. "But life never is." The silence between them deepened until it became unbearable. Hugh reached out, almost without realizing it, and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. His gloved fingers barely touched her skin, but the contact sent a tremor through her that reached her very soul. "Forgive me," he whispered, drawing his hand back. "I forget myself in your presence." Violet's heart ached with everything she could not say. "You forget your sorrow," she said softly. "That is no sin." He turned away, pacing a few steps before stopping beneath his late wife's portrait. "If she could see me now," he said bitterly, "what would she think? That I am faithless, weak?" Violet's voice was quiet but resolute. "She would see a man who still feels. That is strength, not weakness." He looked at her again, and for a heartbeat, the pain in his eyes was replaced by something gentler. "You have an extraordinary way of forgiving things that others cannot." "Perhaps because I have needed forgiveness myself," she murmured. He took a slow breath, as though her words had touched a wound long closed. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what did the world take from you before I found you that night?" Her throat tightened. "Too much," she said finally. "Enough to make me think I would never belong anywhere again." Hugh's voice softened. "And do you? Belong here?" Violet hesitated, her pulse racing. "Some days, yes. Others, I'm reminded that this is not my world." "Perhaps it should be," he said, his tone low, almost defiant. Before she could answer, the door creaked open. Edmund stood there, his small figure framed by the candlelight from the hall. His expression was solemn. "Papa," he said quietly, "Clara is asking for you." Hugh straightened at once, the spell between them shattering. "I'll come at once." Edmund nodded and left without a word. Hugh turned back to Violet, his composure returning, though his voice still carried the echo of emotion. "Thank you for listening," she curtsied. "Always, my lord." He hesitated at the door, then said softly, "You should have lived in another time, Miss Ashford, one where goodness was not punished by rumor." "And you," she replied gently, "should have lived in one where duty did not silence the heart." Their eyes met for one last lingering moment before he left. When the door closed, Violet exhaled shakily. The room felt emptier without him, yet the air still carried the warmth of his presence. She turned back to the portrait and studied the painted woman's face once more. The sadness in those eyes seemed softer now, as though even she, long gone, understood. Violet lowered the cloth once again, covering the painting with care. "Rest," she whispered. "He deserves peace too." Outside, the snow had ceased. A single star glimmered in the indigo sky above the manor. In her heart, Violet knew that what had grown between them was not mere affection. It was something deeper, born of pain and tenderness, of silence shared and hearts slowly awakening. But for now, she could only stand in that dim room, her fingers trembling at her sides, her soul torn between reason and the impossible pull of love. As she left the gallery, the last echo of her footsteps faded into the stillness of the house, and somewhere in the darkened halls of Aldercombe, the faintest ember of hope flickered to life once more. The morning came pale and uncertain, as though even the sun hesitated to rise over Aldercombe. The frost on the windows melted slowly, leaving streaks of silver on the glass. Violet moved quietly through the schoolroom, her hands arranging papers that did not need arranging. Her mind was elsewhere, on the conversation in the portrait room, on the look in Hugh's eyes when she'd told him he could begin again. Since that night, something fragile had lingered between them, a tension like the moment before the first note of a symphony. They spoke little, yet every glance held 1,000 unsaid things. The house itself seemed to sense it. The corridors felt warmer, the laughter of the children freer, as if the walls no longer mourned but dared at last to breathe. Still, Violet feared what that change might cost them both. She had just finished tidying the books when Edmund entered, his face paler than usual. "Father's gone to the stables," he said. "He's been there since dawn." "Has something happened?" Violet asked. He hesitated. "He received another letter, I think from Lady Mercer." Her heart sank. "I see. She's coming again," the boy said, his tone low. "This afternoon." Violet's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. "Thank you, Edmund. You may go." When he left, she sank into the chair by the window, her pulse uneven. The winter light fell across her face, pale and trembling. Lady Mercer's visits were never innocent, never without intention. Violet knew what people said, that a marquess needed a wife of standing, not a governess whispered about by servants. She had no claim on him, and yet the thought of another woman stepping into that place filled her chest with quiet despair. By the time the afternoon arrived, the sky had turned the colour of ash. Hugh returned from the stables, just as the carriage wheels sounded on the gravel. Violet watched from the landing as Lady Mercer descended, wrapped in velvet and confidence. Her beauty was cold and deliberate, her smile the kind that concealed more than it revealed. "Lord Weatherby," she said, extending a gloved hand, "you look pale. You spend too much time among the horses and too little among society." Hugh inclined his head. "Society has little to offer me, Lady Mercer." "Then allow me to correct that," she replied smoothly, her gaze flicking past him toward the staircase where Violet stood half-hidden. "It seems you have been keeping unconventional company." Hugh's jaw tightened. "Miss Ashford is employed here, that is all." Lady Mercer smiled, a glint of amusement in her eyes. "Of course, employment can be such a flexible term in these lonely houses." Violet turned away, her face burning. She fled before she could hear more, her footsteps silent on the stairs. In her chamber, she stood before the small mirror and pressed her hands to her cheeks. "You are foolish," she whispered to her reflection. "You knew what this was." But her heart refused to listen. Downstairs, the afternoon wore on like a long punishment. The wind rose outside, whistling around the corners of the house, carrying with it the scent of rain and something sharper, smoke. Servants hurried past the corridor, their murmurs uneasy. By early evening, as the lamps were being lit, Mrs. Brimley appeared at Violet's door. "Miss Ashford," she said briskly, though her expression betrayed alarm, "a fire has broken out in the east wing. The stable lantern must have fallen. His lordship is already there." Violet's blood turned cold. "The east wing! The nursery corridor! The children are safe in my care," Mrs. Brimley assured her. "But the flames are spreading." Without another thought, Violet gathered her shawl and ran. The corridor was thick with the smell of smoke, sharp and choking. Servants dashed back and forth carrying buckets of water. Through the haze, she saw Hugh, his coat discarded, his face streaked with soot as he shouted orders. "Keep away," he called when he saw her, his voice rough. "It's too dangerous." "I can help," she said, moving closer despite the heat that licked the walls. "Violet." The sound of her name in his voice stopped her heart. He had never said it like that before. Bare, desperate, real. "The fire's trapped the doorway to the servants' quarters," he said. "2 of them are still inside." She glanced at the flames curling across the beams. "Then we must reach them." "You will do no such thing." His tone was fierce, but his eyes betrayed fear. "I will not risk you." "And you would risk yourself?" He did not answer. Instead, he took her hand, rough, strong, trembling, and held it for a moment longer than reason allowed. "If I do not come back, take the children and go to the vicarage. Promise me." Her eyes filled with tears. "I will promise nothing." He gave a half-smile, even as the fire's glow deepened around them. Stubborn woman. Then, before she could stop him, he turned and disappeared through the smoke. The minutes that followed blurred into terror. The roar of flames drowned every thought. Violet stood helpless at the threshold, praying, until at last she saw him emerge, his arm around one of the servants, the other stumbling behind him. They collapsed to the floor just as the ceiling above groaned and gave way, sending a shower of sparks cascading around them. Violet ran forward, falling to her knees beside him. "Hugh!" she cried, her hands trembling as she touched his soot-covered face. "You're hurt!" He coughed, his voice raw. "Only smoke." But there was blood at his temple, a thin line cutting through the ash. She tore a piece of her shawl and pressed it gently against the wound. His hand closed over hers, weak but steady. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "Nor should you," she whispered fiercely. They locked eyes in the chaos, his dark and burning, hers glistening with fear. Around them, servants rushed to extinguish the last of the fire, the sound of splashing water echoing through the hall. When at last the flames subsided, the east wing stood in ruin, its walls blackened, its windows shattered. Violet refused to leave his side until he was safe by the fire in the library. A blanket over his shoulders, a cut on his brow, cleaned and bandaged. The room was quiet now, save for the soft crackle of the hearth. The scent of smoke still clung to their clothes, to their hair, to everything. "Why must you always run toward danger?" Violet said softly, her voice trembling. "Because it seems to follow me," he answered with a weary smile. She shook her head, blinking back tears. "You could have died." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the woman who had faced fire for him, the one whose courage humbled his own. "And if I had," he said quietly, "I would have died knowing what it was to be cared for again." Her throat closed. "Don't speak like that. It's the truth," he murmured. "When I went into those flames, I thought of many things. My children, my duty. But it was your face I saw first." Violet's eyes filled, her voice breaking. "You are exhausted. You must rest." "I cannot rest when every breath reminds me of you." She turned away, trembling. "You must not say such things." "Why?" His tone softened. "Because they are true. Because they are impossible," she whispered. "You know they are." He stood then, unsteady but resolute, and closed the distance between them. "Do you think I care for what the world deems possible? Violet, I have lived in shadow for years. And you," his hand brushed hers, gentle but certain. "You are the first light I have known since her passing." Her tears fell freely now. "You mistake gratitude for love." "No," he said firmly. "I mistook grief for life. This, what I feel now, is not gratitude. It is the very thing I thought had died in me." Her heart raced. "And what of me? What am I to do with such words?" "Believe them," he said simply. She shook her head, stepping back, though her resolve wavered. "If I did, it would destroy us both." He took another step closer, his voice low and trembling. "Or it might save us." The firelight flickered between them, casting their shadows across the wall. Violet could feel her heart beating like wings trapped within her chest. His nearness was unbearable, every breath, every glance, every word. At last she whispered, "Please, Hugh, don't make me choose between sense and what my heart longs for." He looked at her as though seeing her soul laid bare. "Then let your heart win just this once." She closed her eyes, and for a moment time ceased. She felt his hand rise, stopping just short of her cheek, trembling with restraint. The warmth of it was almost a touch, yet not quite. When she finally opened her eyes, he let his hand fall. "Forgive me," he said softly. "You deserve peace, not scandal. And you deserve happiness, not loneliness," she replied. They stood there, the silence between them charged with everything they could not speak. At last, Violet stepped back, her voice breaking. "Good night, my lord." He watched her leave, his chest heavy with everything left unsaid. When the door closed behind her, Hugh sank into the chair by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames. He had faced fire and survived, but it was the quiet after, the aching absence of her, that burned deepest. Upstairs, Violet stood by her window, watching the faint glow of the fire through the trees. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to the cold glass. She had sworn she would never fall, never allow herself to be the cause of ruin, but love had a way of breaking its promises in silence. Outside, the snow began again, soft and slow, covering the scorched earth. It fell on ashes and wounds alike, as if the heavens themselves longed to forgive. And within the quiet heart of Aldercombe, two souls, each scarred by loss, kept vigil in their separate rooms, bound by the same fragile, forbidden hope. Morning arrived with a bruised sort of light, as if the sky had spent the night grieving with the manor. The smell of smoke still clung to Aldercombe's corridors, faint, stubborn, woven into stone and wood, like a warning that beauty could vanish in a single hour. Servants moved quietly, stepping around blackened patches on the floor where buckets had been dragged and spilled. The east wing sat behind closed doors now, condemned to silence until repairs could begin, its windows blown out like blinded eyes. Violet woke before the household bells, her body aching with exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. She had barely closed her eyes, and when she had, the fire returned in her dreams. Orange light licking at beams, the roar like a beast, Hugh's face streaked with soot, his voice saying her name as though it were prayer and confession in the same breath. She rose and dressed slowly, choosing her plainest gown, her most modest ribbon. Her hands were steady, but her heart was not. She braided her chestnut hair into a careful knot and pinned it down with a discipline that felt almost desperate. It was easier to manage hair than hope. When she stepped into the corridor, she heard low voices behind a door and paused long enough to recognize Hugh's tone. Quiet, controlled, threaded with fatigue. Another voice answered him, older, precise, the cadence of a man used to documents and law. Violet's breath caught. She did not linger. She had learned what listening to doors could cost a woman. Instead, she went to the nursery. Clara sat on the rug with her doll, unusually subdued, the child's cheeks still pale from the fright of the previous night. Edmund stood near the window, arms folded, his posture too rigid for mourning. When Violet entered, both children looked up at once. Clara's lips trembled. "Is Papa hurt?" Violet crossed to her and knelt, smoothing a curl from the child's forehead. "He's safe," she said softly. "He needs rest. But he is safe." Edmund's eyes narrowed. "He bleeds when he thinks no one is watching." Violet's throat tightened. "Then we will watch," she murmured. Not to intrude, but to care. Edmund looked away as if the word care embarrassed him. "Lady Mercer will say it was your fault," he muttered. Violet's fingers stilled. "Why would she say that?" "Because she says everything is someone's fault," Edmund replied, his voice sharp with a child's bitter wisdom. "And because she thinks this house belongs to her." Clara clutched Violet's sleeve. "I don't want her here." Violet kissed the child's temple. "You won't be alone," she promised, though she did not know what form that promise would take by sundown. The morning passed in uneasy stillness, the manor moving like a body bruised. After luncheon, Mrs. Brimley appeared in the doorway of the schoolroom, her expression carved into the kind of calm that did not invite argument. "Miss Ashford," she said, "his lordship asks that you come to the library." Violet rose at once, her pulse quickening. She followed Mrs. Brimley down the corridor, past soot-darkened walls and the closed doors of the east wing. The nearer she drew to the library, the more she felt as if she were walking toward a precipice. Hugh stood by the hearth when she entered, his hair still damp from a recent washing, his brow bandaged neatly. A blanket lay over the back of his chair, discarded like pride. His coat was dark and impeccable again, but the bruise at his temple made him look painfully human. Across the room sat a gentleman Violet did not recognize, tall, thin, with careful whiskers and the restrained attire of a solicitor. He rose and bowed. "Miss Ashford," Hugh said, his voice low, and Violet's heart responded as if it belonged to him. "Thank you for coming," she curtsied. "My lord." The solicitor inclined his head. "Mr. Radcliffe, at your service. I was summoned from Bath at Lord Aldercomb's request." Bath. The word landed like a key, turning in a lock. Violet remembered the messenger, the urgency, the way Hugh had been interrupted in the conservatory when his honesty had nearly undone him. Hugh gestured gently. "Please sit, Miss Ashford." Violet obeyed, folding her hands in her lap. The fire crackled softly, warm and steady, as if determined to prove it could be tamed. Hugh's gaze held hers. "There are things you deserve to know," he began. "Not because you owe me anything, but because the danger that found you did not disappear when I paid that debt." Violet's breath caught. "Danger." Mr. Radcliffe cleared his throat. "My lord, if I may—" Hugh nodded. "Speak." The solicitor opened a folder and drew out papers stamped with seals. "The auction at the Coaching Inn," he said carefully, "was presented as a charitable resolution of debt. In truth, it is part of a network, quiet, profitable, protected by respectable names. Debts are inflated, accounts altered, and young women of vulnerable circumstance are placed in households where scandal can be manufactured at will." Violet's fingers tightened. Her skin went cold, though the fire was near. She kept her voice steady with sheer pride. "You mean it was never meant to end with payment?" Hugh's jaw tightened. "No," he said softly. "It was meant to end with possession, or ruin, or both." Violet swallowed. She heard her own heartbeat like distant drums. "Who?" Mr. Radcliffe hesitated. Hugh's eyes hardened. "Say it." The solicitor's gaze lowered to the papers as if the ink itself were unpleasant. "The documents bear the marks of a local solicitor, Mr. Sallow, who has long sought influence through Lady Mercer's circle. There are letters," he added, voice tightening, "that suggest the event was encouraged by those who wished to test your lordship's vulnerabilities." Violet's breath stopped. Lady Mercer. Hugh did not flinch at the name. "She wanted a story," he said, quiet and lethal. "A marquess who brings home a young woman under questionable circumstances. A household that becomes a theatre for gossip. She would have offered herself as the solution, respectability in exchange for control." Violet's throat tightened with something like grief and fury combined. "And the fire?" Hugh's gaze dropped for a brief moment, then returned to hers. "The lantern that fell was one that should not have been in that corridor," he said. "It was moved. It was placed. The servants swear it." Mr. Radcliffe added carefully, "One of the stable lads admits he was paid to carry it inside, told it was an order." Violet's hands trembled once, then stilled. She forced herself to breathe. "So she would destroy part of your house to frighten you into needing her." Hugh's voice softened, and that softness cut Violet more deeply than anger. "Or to frighten you into leaving." Silence fell, thick as velvet. Violet lifted her chin. "And what will you do?" Hugh looked at her, as though the question were both simple and sacred. "I will end it," he said. "Not with whispers, not with polite retreats, with truth." Mr. Radcliffe closed his folder. "The magistrate in the village will act if he has evidence. The difficulty, my lord, is persuading Mr. Sallow to confirm anything without pressure," Hugh finished, his eyes sharpening. "Then he will have pressure." Violet rose before she could stop herself. The movement startled them both. "My lord," she whispered, and her voice shook despite her effort, "this will stain you." Hugh stood too, slowly, as if his injuries reminded him he was mortal. "I have lived stained by grief for years," he said. "I will not be stained by cowardice." Mr. Radcliffe bowed. "I will wait in the corridor, my lord." When the solicitor left, the room seemed to shrink. The fire's glow made everything intimate. The edges of books, the curve of the chair, the bandage on Hugh's brow. Violet remained standing, her hands clenched. "You shouldn't fight this alone," she said softly. Hugh's gaze moved over her face, lingering as if he needed to memorize the courage there. "I am not alone," he murmured. "Not anymore." The words made her throat tighten. "Hugh." He stepped closer, and she felt the warmth of him before he touched her. His voice lowered, reverent and raw. "Last night, when the flames rose, I realized something I have avoided since I first heard my own heart break. I can lose property. I can lose reputation. I can lose comfort. But when I imagined losing you..." Violet's eyes burned. "Don't!" He stopped, but only for a breath. "I cannot stop," he whispered. "Not now. Not after the truth has finally shown its face." Violet's hands trembled as she lifted them, not to touch him, but to steady herself in the storm of his nearness. "If you speak like this," she said, "you will make me believe you." Hugh's mouth softened into something that was not quite a smile, but close. "Then believe me," he said. "Not because I am a marquess, not because you were rescued. Believe me because I have never been more honest than I am in this moment." Violet swallowed, her heart pounding. "Honesty is dangerous," she whispered. "So is silence," Hugh replied. For one fragile heartbeat, it felt as if the world held still for them. Then a knock came at the door, sharp and urgent. Mrs. Brimley entered, her composure stretched thin. "My lord," she said, "Lady Mercer has arrived." The name struck Violet like cold water. Hugh's expression did not change, but the air around him became iron. "Good," he said quietly. "Bring her to the drawing room." Violet's breath caught. "Hugh." He turned to her, and in his gaze was a fierce tenderness. "Stay with the children," he murmured. "Whatever happens today, they must feel steadiness." Violet nodded, though her heart resisted leaving him. "Be careful," she whispered. Hugh's eyes softened. "I am careful," he said. "I am also finished." Violet returned to the nursery, where the children sensed tension like animals sense a storm. Clara climbed into Violet's lap without asking. Edmund hovered near the window, watching the front drive with narrowed eyes. Downstairs, voices rose, Lady Mercer's smooth sweetness, Hugh's low restraint. Violet could not hear words clearly, only the cadence of confrontation, the rhythm of something breaking. A while later, a footman came up, pale as linen. "Miss Ashford," he said softly, "his lordship requests you in the drawing room." Violet's body went cold. Clara clutched her sleeve. "No," the girl whispered. Violet kissed Clara's hair. "Stay with Edmund," she said gently. "I will be right outside the door if you need me." Edmund's eyes flashed. "If she hurts you," he muttered, "You'll breathe." Violet interrupted softly, holding his gaze. "And you'll remember you are a gentleman." She went. The drawing room was bright with winter light, the curtains open as if Hugh wanted every shadow exposed. Lady Mercer stood near the mantel, draped in velvet and indignation, her cheeks flushed with outrage disguised as concern. Hugh stood opposite her, tall and still, his bandage visible like a quiet reminder that danger had already touched him and failed. Lady Mercer's eyes snapped to Violet. "How theatrical," she said, voice honeyed. "Summoning the little governess to witness her own downfall." Hugh's tone was calm enough to frighten. "Mind your language," he said. "Miss Ashford is under my protection." Lady Mercer laughed softly. "Protection," she purred. "How noble, how predictable. Hugh, you cannot possibly intend to ruin yourself for a girl the village has already priced." Violet's face burned, but she did not flinch. Hugh stepped forward one pace. "You speak of ruin," he said, "as if you do not understand it. You have dealt it for sport." Lady Mercer's smile sharpened. "Be careful," she hissed. "A man can lose everything by choosing the wrong woman." Hugh's gaze did not waver. "Then it is fortunate," he replied, "that I have finally recognized the wrong one." Silence fell like a blade. Lady Mercer's eyes narrowed. "You are unwell," she said quickly, shifting tactics. "Grief has made you reckless. You need someone sensible, someone suitable." Hugh's voice dropped, and every word felt like a verdict. "I needed someone kind," he said, "someone steady, someone who could enter a house full of ghosts and refuse to fear them. You could never have done that, because you are more frightened of whispers than you are of wickedness." Lady Mercer's breath hitched. "Wickedness," she spat. "Are you accusing me?" Hugh lifted a paper from the table and held it out. "This is a statement from the stable lad," he said. "This is Mr. Radcliffe's evidence from Bath. And this," he added, eyes hardening, "is the magistrate's notice. Mr. Sallow has already been summoned." Lady Mercer's face drained of colour. Violet's heart pounded, not with triumph but with awe. Hugh had moved in silence, not in cowardice, but in preparation. Lady Mercer's gaze swung to Violet, pure hatred now. "You," she whispered, "you have bewitched him." Violet's voice came out steady, though her hands trembled beneath her sleeves. "No," she said quietly. "He simply remembered himself." Hugh turned slightly toward Violet then, and the look he gave her was not the gaze of a marquess surveying an employee. It was something deeper, almost sacred, like a man recognizing home. Lady Mercer's lips curled. "If you do this," she warned Hugh, "society will turn its back." Hugh's answer was soft and final. "Then I will build my life without society," he said. "I have lived without happiness long enough." Lady Mercer stared at him, then at Violet, and for a moment it looked as if she might strike. Instead she gathered her skirts with shaking hands and swept toward the door, her pride barely holding her upright. As she passed Violet, she hissed, "Enjoy your fairy tale. The world devours girls like you." Violet did not move. "Then it will learn," she replied softly, "that I am not easy to swallow." Lady Mercer froze, stunned by the quiet defiance. Then she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of roses and venom behind. The room fell silent. Hugh exhaled slowly, as though he had been holding his breath for years. He turned to Violet, and the severity in his face softened into something that made Violet's chest ache. "I'm sorry," he murmured, "for bringing you into a war you never asked for." Violet stepped closer, her voice trembling with emotion she could no longer hide. "You brought me into a home," she whispered, "and then you taught me what it means to be defended without being owned." Hugh's eyes glistened, the smallest betrayal of feeling. "I have wanted to touch you 100 times, he said quietly, "and I have stopped myself every time because I thought restraint was honor." "It is," Violet breathed. He moved closer still, stopping just short of her. "But honor without truth is only fear wearing a better coat," he murmured. "And I am tired of fear." Violet's heart hammered. "Hugh!" He lifted his hand slowly, as if asking permission from the air itself, and this time his fingers brushed her cheek. So light it was almost not a touch at all, yet it sent warmth through her like sunrise after a long winter. Violet's eyes fluttered closed, not from weakness, but from the relief of tenderness that did not demand anything but sincerity. When she opened her eyes, Hugh's gaze held hers, with an intensity that made the room feel too small. "I will not ask you to be brave alone," he said. "Not ever again." Violet's voice broke. "What are you saying?" Hugh swallowed, and for the first time she saw him truly nervous, not as a marquess, but as a man about to place his heart in another's hands. "I am saying," he whispered, "that I want a life with you that is not borrowed, not temporary, not hidden behind titles like governess and employer." Tears blurred Violet's vision. "And your children?" At that, Hugh's expression softened. "They deserve love that stays," he said, "not love that disappears when the world frowns." As if summoned by the word love, small footsteps sounded in the hall. The door creaked open. Clara stood there, clutching her doll and something else. Violet ribbon, slightly rumpled from tiny hands. Edmund stood behind her, rigid and pale, as though he had pushed himself into courage by force. Violet's breath caught. "Clara! Edmund!" Clara hurried forward and held out the ribbon to Violet. Her voice was small but firm. "For you," she whispered, because you make the house less cold. Violet's hands shook as she accepted it. Oh, Clara! Edmund did not look at Violet at first. He looked at his father. Are you going to send her away? He asked, blunt and frightened in the way only a child can be when pride fails. Hugh crouched slightly, lowering himself to Edmund's height, his voice gentle. No, he said. Not if she will stay. Edmund swallowed hard. His gaze shifted to Violet then, and in his eyes was a battle between loyalty to the past and hunger for warmth in the present. I wrote something once, he muttered, cheeks reddening. It was cruel. Violet's throat tightened. She knelt and looked at him as steadily as she had on the first day. You were protecting your heart, she said softly. I understand. Edmund's jaw trembled just once. I don't want Papa to be a storm all the time, he whispered. Hugh's hand came to rest lightly on Edmund's shoulder. Then help me be something else, he said. Clara reached for Violet's hand. Violet let her fingers close around the child's, the ribbon looped around her palm like a vow. Hugh stood, and his gaze returned to Violet with a quiet fierceness. Violet Ashford, he said, voice low and certain. I cannot offer you a life without gossip. I cannot promise the world will be kind, but I can promise you this house will be. Violet's breath trembled. Hugh. He took her hands, both of them careful, reverent, as though holding something holy. Marry me, he said simply. Not as a rescue, not as a scandal, as a choice, as a truth. The room fell silent except for the fire's gentle crackle. Violet looked at him, and in his eyes she saw everything she had tried not to want. Steadiness, devotion, a love forged not in ease but in endurance. She thought of the auction room, the cold stares, the shame. She thought of the nursery thunder, the conservatory's winter light, the portrait room's ghosts. She thought of how Hugh had defended her not with possession, but with dignity. She swallowed, tears spilling down her cheeks without apology. Yes, she whispered, yes, I will. Hugh's breath broke like a man who had been drowning and finally reached air. He lifted her hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, brief, controlled, yet full of devotion so intense Violet's knees nearly weakened. He did not take more. He only held her as if he feared she might vanish. Clara clapped softly, as if afraid to frighten the happiness away. Edmund stared at the floor, blinking hard, then muttered, Good. That single word, grudging and sincere, shattered something inside Violet. She laughed through tears, and the sound seemed to startle the walls themselves, as though Aldecombe had forgotten laughter could live here without breaking. That evening, Hugh insisted they go to the village, not to apologize, not to ask permission, but to stand in daylight with the truth. The winter fete had been planned long before the fire, a small gathering in the parish hall to raise funds for the poor. Villagers turned as Hugh entered with Violet beside him, Clara holding Violet's hand and Edmund walking close, protective without realizing he was doing it. Whispers rose, then faltered when Hugh's gaze swept the room, calm, unyielding, finished with fear. He guided Violet to the center when the fiddler began a simple tune. He offered his hand. Violet's breath caught. They're watching. Let them, Hugh murmured. They will learn. She placed her hand in his, and he drew her into the dance with a tenderness so steady it felt like safety itself. They moved slowly, not as a performance, but as a declaration. Two hearts choosing truth over rumor. As they turned, Violet saw faces soften, saw curiosity become something else, wonder, perhaps, or reluctant respect. She did not need it, but the sight eased a weight she had carried too long. Hugh's voice brushed her ear, low enough that only she could hear. "Do you feel it?" "What?" she whispered, trembling. "My house," he murmured. "It's breathing." Violet looked up at him, her eyes shining. "So are you," she whispered back. For a moment the noise of the hall faded. There was only his hand at her waist, steady and careful, and the warmth in his eyes, no longer haunted by the past, but lit by the courage of a future they had chosen together. When the dance ended, Hugh did not release her immediately. His thumb brushed lightly over her glove, a touch so small it could have been nothing, except Violet felt everything in it. Promise, devotion, home. Outside, the air was crisp, the stars bright as spilled sugar across the sky. As they returned to the carriage, Clara leaned sleepily against Violet's side, and Edmund walked close to Hugh, glancing up at him as if trying to memorize the sight of his father smiling. At the manor gates, Hugh paused, looking up at the honey-coloured stone that had held his grief for too long. He took Violet's hand. "Welcome home," he said, voice rough with emotion. Violet's throat tightened as she looked at the glowing windows, the warmth behind them, the children between them, the ribbon looped around her fingers like fate made gentle. "I was waiting to hear that my entire life," she whispered. Hugh's gaze held hers, steady as a vow. "Then hear it again," he murmured. "Home. Always." And Aldecombe, scarred, smoky, stubbornly alive, seemed to answer with the quietest exhale, as if love itself had finally opened every window. Aldecombe in spring was almost unrecognizable. The once somber estate, once weighed down by silence and grief, now bloomed with the unrestrained laughter of life. The east wing, rebuilt long ago, gleamed with soft golden light through its wide new windows. The roses in the courtyard climbed higher each year, their perfume drifting into open rooms, and the walls, those old witnesses of sorrow, seemed at last to have forgiven the past. The world beyond had changed too. The long reach of industry had softened the edges of class. The old hierarchies still stood, but they leaned, weary, toward reform. In the village, people spoke of fairness now with less fear, and of love with less scorn. Even the gossip that once fluttered like cold wind through every doorway had grown quiet, replaced by respect for those who had endured its cruelty and outlived it with grace. In the West Gardens, under the pale blush of apple blossoms, Violet Weatherby stood watching her children chase one another through the grass. There were 3 of them, 2 boys with their father's dark eyes and restless spirit, and a little girl who bore her mother's smile but her father's courage. Their laughter rang through the orchard, clear and wild as birdsong. Violet wore a gown the colour of soft cream, her hair loosely gathered beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat. She was no longer the timid governess who had once walked these corridors with quiet dread. The years had deepened her rather than aged her. Her beauty was no longer delicate but luminous, touched by serenity and the strength of a woman who had survived the weight of judgment and chosen love anyway. From the terrace came Hugh's voice, deep and familiar. "You will spoil them, you know," he called as he descended the steps, his coat unbuttoned, his smile unguarded. Violet turned, that same quiet warmth in her eyes that had undone him years ago. "Children cannot be spoiled by happiness," she replied. He came to stand beside her, his arm brushing hers. His hair had silvered at the temples, but the years had made him more distinguished, not diminished. There was a lightness to him now, something no one who'd known him a decade ago would have believed possible. "I meant with tarts," he said with mock gravity. "Cook says you've let them have 2 each." Violet smiled, turning toward the orchard again. "Then let them have a 3rd. It's spring." Hugh laughed softly, the sound still rare enough to make her heart tighten. He slipped his hand into hers, his thumb tracing the familiar curve of her knuckles. "9 years," he murmured, "and I still find you in the morning light and think I'm dreaming." She leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "9 years," she echoed, "and I still wake up and remember that dreams can last if you tend to them." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the children run beneath the trees. In the distance, a carriage passed along the road to the village, a sleek vehicle bearing the crest of the Mercer family, but it no longer stirred fear or bitterness in either of them. Lady Mercer had left England some years ago, retreating to the continent after her schemes came to light. Society had not been cruel to her. It had been indifferent, which was far worse. Her title remained, her fortune too, but her invitations had stopped arriving. She lived now in a grand house by the sea, surrounded by mirrors and memories, neither of which offered much comfort. "Do you ever think of her?" Violet asked quietly, following his gaze. "Only as a lesson," Hugh replied. "She taught me what power without love becomes. Ash." Violet's fingers tightened around his. "And what did I teach you?" He looked down at her, his expression softening. "That love," he said, "when it's true, doesn't erase the past, it redeems it." Her eyes glistened with quiet joy. Inside the house, voices drifted from the parlor. Edmund's deeper now, yet still bearing traces of the boy who had once feared losing everything. He was nearly grown, already tall, already proud, yet tempered by the gentleness Violet had taught him. He was preparing to leave for university in London to study natural philosophy. His curiosity was endless, his heart loyal. Clara, now 14, had inherited her mother's sense of wonder and her father's stubborn will. She painted often, portraits, landscapes, sometimes even ghosts from her imagination. Her latest work hung in the newly restored gallery, a tender depiction of a woman standing in a field of violets, her hands clasped in the light. Hugh had insisted it stay there, beside the portrait of his first wife, no longer hidden beneath a black cloth, but framed in acceptance. Every painting in that room told a story, not only of lineage, but of healing. From the orchard, their eldest son, Thomas, came running toward them, his cheeks flushed. "Papa, Mama, the colt's taken its first steps." Violet's face lit up. "Truly?" Hugh smiled. "Then we must go and see. Come, my love, our empire awaits." They walked hand in hand toward the stables, their pace unhurried, as though time itself had learned to yield to them. Near the gate, Mrs. Brimley stood with a shawl over her shoulders, older but no less commanding. She watched them pass with a look somewhere between pride and disbelief. "You were right, Miss Ashe, Lady Weatherby," she called, correcting herself with a small smile. "The house breathes easier these days." Violet turned to her with a twinkle of affection. "As do we all." The afternoon stretched golden and calm, the kind of day that seemed to carry eternity in its warmth. Later, as dusk fell and the children were gathered in the drawing room, Hugh sat by the fire with Violet curled beside him on the settee. The flames painted soft light on the familiar walls, and outside the rain began again, gentle, cleansing, a reminder of everything they had endured. Violet reached for the small ribbon tucked between the pages of her book, the same one Clara had given her years before. Faded now, frayed at the edges, but still violet in hue. She smiled faintly. "Do you remember?" Hugh brushed a kiss across her hair. "I remember every moment that brought me here." She rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, a sound steadier than any clock. "Sometimes," she whispered, "I wonder what we would have been if not for that night. If you hadn't walked into the fire," he chuckled softly, "then I would have spent the rest of my life in ashes and never known what it was to rise from them." Violet closed her eyes, letting the rhythm of his breathing lull her into stillness. "You still speak like a poet. Only when I speak to you," he murmured. For a while, neither said more. The rain deepened, tapping softly against the windows. In the corner, Clara hummed while sketching, Edmund read beside her, and the little ones whispered secret plans of their own. The room felt alive, ordinary and sacred all at once. 9 years had passed, and yet their love had not dimmed. It had changed shape, yes, grown quieter, surer, less like a spark and more like a steady flame. A love no longer afraid of the world's cold breath, because it had learned to make its own warmth. Outside, the orchard swayed beneath the soft rain, the blossoms shivering but unbroken, and within the walls of Aldercombe, where sorrow had once dwelled, peace reigned at last. Not the fragile peace of silence, but the deep peace of hearts that had dared to love against the odds and had been proven right. As the evening faded into night, Violet lifted her gaze to Hugh's, her voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me," she said, that when the years take us, the house will still remember laughter." Hugh smiled, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, tender and certain. "It will," he said, "because you've taught it how." The fire crackled, the rain fell, and somewhere in the garden the first stars began to show, bright, unwavering, eternal. And Aldercombe, once a house of ghosts, stood alive with light, its every window glowing like a heartbeat that refused to fade. And so, dear listener, the story of Violet and Hugh comes to its gentle close, a tale born from ashes and rebuilt with love, courage, and forgiveness. In the quiet halls of Aldercombe, we saw how the human heart can heal even after being shattered, how kindness can outlast cruelty, and how the truest love is not the one that rescues, it is the one that stays. Perhaps that is what this story wished to remind us all, that second chances do not arrive wrapped in perfection, but in imperfection made sacred by grace, that love is not weakened by time, but refined by it, and that no matter how fierce the storms may be, there will always come a morning when the house, like the heart, finally learns to breathe again. If you felt something while listening to this story, if it stirred a memory, a longing, or a quiet smile, leave me one word in the comments: home. That simple word means you stayed with Violet and Hugh until the very end, and that you too believe in love that endures. Your comments, your words, your presence here, each one helps this little corner of stories grow and reach others who still believe in timeless romance. And if you'd like to support the team who brings these stories to life, you can send a super thanks on YouTube with whatever amount feels right to you. Every bit of encouragement, every gesture keeps these tales alive. And if that's not possible today, you can still help in the most meaningful way by sharing this story with someone you think might need its warmth. A friend, a mother, a grandmother, or simply someone who has forgotten that love, real love, still exists. Thank you for being part of this journey through time and tenderness. Stay a little longer if you wish, and discover more stories like this one in the cards I've left for you, each filled with romance, hope, and the beauty of hearts that dare to begin again. Because, after all, every love story begins the moment someone chooses to stay.